Welcome to the Wolf and Bull podcast. I am your host, and I have screwed it up again, but I guess I am the wolf, and I also have a few other spectacular individuals with me, per usual, on the show. One of them is the bull. Wow. Works every time.
I am here.
We've got to find
present.
a better logo.
I am present, I am past, and I am future.
Yeah, I just said we have to find a better...
He's Scrooge.
Somebody has to find a better logo, and that's me projecting the things that I need to do. So yeah, that's a weird thing for me to have a Freudian slip over. And then
we could be like football and just wear different uniforms.
Change the names for no reason. And then we also have Beowulf, the third guest, perpetual guest, so the third host on the show. Again, another Freudian slip.
That's me.
Me, full of Freudian slips today.
It's all good.
And welcome to episode 67. Just before we jump into the episode, just a reminder for our listeners, our viewers, for anyone tuning in, if you're tuning in by letter, just go ahead and give us a follow on Instagram. If you like some of our content, go ahead and give us a subscription on YouTube. We have episodes every week. I believe YouTube episodes are coming out normally on Fridays, and then the audio versions of this episode episodes will be on Thursdays. 5-star review on Spotify or any major listening platform would be much appreciated. But yeah, I think that's everything. Did I cover everything?
Well said.
Yes. Well put.
Mm-hmm.
Gotta streamline this. The intros are just...
It's
I think
okay.
they're great.
It's chaotic.
There's a call to action there.
Exactly.
Subscribe, people.
If people
leave a good review.
People need calls to action. They
Indeed.
need to feel engaged.
Yeah.
And you make them feel engaged.
Oh,
you're
thank you.
a kind, friendly wolf. Yeah, you're the wolf that came to the door dressed as... Oh, no, didn't come to
grandma.
the door. You're the wolf that was already in bed as grandma.
I identified as a grandma. I was identifying before my time.
You were kind of full and trying to take a nap because you'd already eaten grandma, apparently.
Yeah.
This is an odd...
Soft meat.
What the...
This is very strange.
My, what large dentures you have, Grandma.
Yeah, right? So how's everybody doing? This is a very strange intro to this episode. My co-host, Bull, who loves dentures. How was your week going?
What does that mean?
I don't know.
I got my chompers.
Yeah, how's your week
My
going?
chompers and my hones.
What is...
I have no idea what accent that is.
We're never giving you coffee again.
Coffee is the new...
You know what? There's nothing better. My drug of choice right here.
Coffee specifically? Or caffeine?
In a Yosemite.
Yosemite, are you joking?
I know, yes,
oh
I'm
my
joking.
gosh.
Of course I'm joking.
You concerned me for a second there.
Wow, I got you.
You did.
I don't even have to say any dad jokes today.
Yosemite cup. Wait, so is coffee
Yosemite.
your choice, or is it caffeine in general? Like, could
Did I
you
say
just
there was
slug back
coffee in
and...
No,
Would you just slug back an energy drink and call it a day? Or?
I remember the very first time I ever had coffee beans. I think they were chocolate-covered coffee beans, but just by themselves, they were wonderful.
Yeah.
And I was like, why do we brew these up? Why don't we just crunch them down?
Well, you got to dip them in chocolate first. That's when they're really good.
Yeah.
Chocolate-covered coffee beans.
Oh, they were awesome. I had them in, I don't know, probably Hawaii or something like that. They were awesome.
So strange chocolate-covered coffee bean stories aside, Beowulf, how are you? Good? Everything's great in Beowulf land?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It's great. We have the Irish music playing at all times.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's good. I like I was just saying before we turned all the recording equipment on, I was looking forward to making dinner.
Yeah.
So
wow.
That's the most exciting thing.
This is intriguing.
Going on,
Fascinating.
yes.
Fascinating.
We're just going to make chocolate-covered coffee beans for dinner.
Wow.
That's it.
This is so chaotic. This is chaotic.
You'd be having breakfast at like 3 a.m. because you'd still be up.
I don't know. I'm rather neutral about the subject.
Well, I think I'm going to jump into the monologue. Again, I have once again outdone myself. Every week.
Always.
I just keep getting better, faster, stronger, Kanye. I truly believe that this topic today will be an interesting one. So, Baltimore prosecutors have dropped charges against Adnan Syed, a Muslim American man who was wrongly convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend, Heyman Lee, in 1999. Now, Beowulf and I closely followed his story when the Serial podcast covered it in 2014, and it's definitely interesting to see a silver lining to an obviously tragic series of events. Hopefully, we find out who took Heyman Lee's life. This brings me to the topic of sides. Whether it's Adnan Syed, Tiger King, or Stephen Avery from Making a Murderer, there has been a recent uptick, if you haven't noticed, in which societal pressures have demanded adherence and agreement. The monolith of social groupthink, radicalization, has grown exponentially, and it's reared its ugly head time and again over the last few years especially. In a world desperate for acceptance, hungry for purpose, and obsessed with ideology, it seems impossible to avoid radicalization. Whether it be the latest social event, political quagmire, a national call to action, or theological debate, it seems our loyalty is constantly being demanded by radicalized groups around us, often in favor of their movements, unsurprisingly. Ironically, many of these groups utilize the same level of hyperbole to express and gather support for their positions, albeit from very different sides of the aisle, ultimately segmenting society in the ways that we're currently struggling with today. The quote-unquote either you're with us or against us arguments are as common online as mosquitoes are during a wet, hot, unbearably steamy summer. Engaging in reasoned debate from some positions is seen as excusatory to the opposing sides, and thus deemed pointless. But why? This brings us to our topic today, the supposedly myth of neutrality. According to many, total neutrality is a myth, a sign of weakness, and an indication that those who choose to be neutral choose to be of the status quo. This all may be true, or it could all be false. We'll chat about this today. I had a brain aneurysm in the middle of that episode.
Oh, I thought that was like...
I thought it was the suspense.
Yeah, pausing for effect.
I don't know, with the background music, it was good.
I was hanging on your every note. Right?
I got really interested in the music myself.
You were like...
I was kind of...
I was like falling asleep. That
was great.
Well, that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about the quote-unquote myth of neutrality.
Have you noticed, you've noticed a thread through probably every one of our podcasts. There's this kind of thread that it's almost going back to, remember the podcast we did about, I always say entomology, and I'm not talking about insects, it's etymology.
Yes.
And that, the origin of words and things like that. And really what it comes down to is definitions. Mm-hmm. And it seems like every subject we come up to is a debate over the definition of something. Myth, real, bias, unbiased. Which side of the aisle you on? Are you... And I always find it interesting that people talk about the sides of the aisle. Because when you talk about that, what do you visualize? Typically politics, maybe some cathedral or something where there's aisles on either side and there's kind of, or... in a wedding, there's the groom side and the bride side.
I visualize
kinds of things.
The Loch Ness Monster.
And when you think of Isles, like Isles of Scotland?
It was a joke. Yeah.
I love that. That was very good.
Like
that
that
should have been my joke, by the way.
You're
so I'm going to have to accuse you.
Of joke stealing?
Exactly.
Joke recycling?
That's well, when there's a monster in the lake.
Right.
You got to go for it, right?
Or a cathedral.
Exactly. And there's monsters in cathedrals. But the thing I was getting back to on this other side of the aisle thing, it gives us this impression that everything is so differential. Not differential to each other, but different from each other. Either side of the aisle is so polarized. And certainly, there's the back of the room and the front of the room and the sides of the aisle. And you can talk about all those things. But ultimately, we're all in the same building. Unless you're in the Isle of Skye or something like that, as you talked about. But
You're gone.
Coffee took him out.
I was going to say hairball, but that's not what bulls do. That they got 4 stomachs to take care of those kind of things.
Are you feeling unwell? I'm not going to do a Pfizer commercial.
There you go.
Or watch some movie and they used a similar sounding. Corporations are always the bad guys, right? In all these big movies,
Always.
And this one had a bad guy corporation that sounded like Pfizer.
Yeah,
wasn't, but sounded like.
Well, it really hit home for me about the corporations being bad during Lego Movie. I was really really impacted by that. Like, it really stuck with me when I don't remember the bad guy's name, but when he was a corporate,
such a good movie.
It really is. Yeah, it was fantastic. And that's our references
Anyway,
now. We're going back in
just
time.
to finalize this before I, gave myself a coughing aneurysm there, is that we're all in the same building. No matter what side we are on these different debates we talk about, and whether we're talking about politics, religion, philosophy, theology, whatever you want to talk about, we're on different sides of the aisle, but I've always conceptualized it that we're all in the same building. We're all in the same club. And what's happening now is that we're made to feel like we're in two different opposing clubs. We're on different teams. We're not in the same stadium even. We don't shake hands after the game or even before the game. We don't, using football reference, we don't trade jerseys or any of that shit. We just, keep firing bombs at each other until, somebody decides it's just no fun, takes their toys and goes home.
Yeah. And I think that there's a reason why we always talk about the definitional points of things. Primarily because I think there's a lot of social conflation of terms in our culture. I think it's become very popularized. Now, granted, we've talked about specifically in that episode that you mentioned the different meanings of things and how it's in flux a lot of the time. But I do think as of late, and we've touched on this before, that things have kind of hit warp speed when it comes to that type of interpretation. And one of those things is the idea of neutrality. Now, this little backstory about why this is even a topic. A few episodes ago, I believe it was boiling frog syndrome, we were talking about a few different things. And during the research of that episode, I actually came across an article that talked about how neutrality, from a theological perspective, was a complete and total myth. Now, I don't want to dive too deep into the theology aspect of things. I have my opinions on that. But I do think that belief system can be extrapolated out to other facets of society, be it science, social movements, cultural interpretations, and I think it has. I think that people have taken the position as of late that there is no such thing as accurate neutrality. Now, I don't mean that it's either good or bad. Really, the purpose of this episode is not to say either way, really. It's more to kind of discuss.
That's a very neutral thing to say.
Well, I don't want to put across this perception that I think it's either good or bad, because I think it's based on context. I think that, when you talk about natural events that are extreme, like historical events, obviously, you don't want to be found on the neutral side of things. But when it comes to some of the things within our society that are almost fungible in a lot of ways or cyclical, there's this call to, you got to be on one side or the other, when in reality, you don't.
Yeah, well, interpretation is everything. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you're saying. It's sometimes history provides that viewpoint on interpreting what those things, where you should have fallen on one side or another. A lot of people believe that taking the position of neutrality, especially as it juxtaposes against things like conflict, wars, etc., is you only see clearly after the fact. Mm-hmm. And the people that determine the rights and wrongs of that end up determining whether somebody should have been neutral, somebody should have been on one side, should have been on another. But I don't know if you ever heard the old saying that hear what I mean, not what I say.
Yeah,
and that kind of encapsulates the way I feel about a lot of this stuff, because I can say, everybody on earth has had conversations with another person and had a specific thing they were trying to get across and did everything in their power to get it across a certain way so the other person recognized what they said to be this way, 1 + 1 is 2, right? Mm-hmm. And the other person heard it a different way. So the all words are is symbols for meanings. That's all they really are. That's what we talk about in these podcasts all the time, is how to interpret through your life course which direction to take, which road to follow, which person to emulate, which person not to. And being neutral has this conflated idea that it's somehow even-handed, maybe. Mm-hmm. I think that's wrong. I think we'll dive into that a little bit, but I think there's more to it than that.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. I think that there's this, and I think we're going to agree on a lot on this episode in particular. I don't think there's going to be a lot of traditional headbutting. We'll
that's
make
no fun.
something.
I'll take the opposing argument.
You take
so whatever side you take, I'll take the opposite. Okay. Because I want to be.
That's fair.
I want to be right as normal.
No, of course.
60% of the time.
Yeah, well, 100% of the time.
60% of the time.
So for our listeners, for our viewers, just a little bit of background, definitely, just specifically on the definition side of things and the philosophical side of things when it comes to neutrality. Now, neutrality from a definitional perspective is the state of or policy of being neutral, especially non-participation in war. So what is it, Switzerland? Or is it Sweden?
People talk all the time.
Switzerland's completely neutral, I believe.
Or if you're a pacifist.
Yeah, so there's pacifism. And then
the same thing? No,
it's similar. It's similar. It's not the same.
Not exactly the same.
No, they just don't want to get involved in taking sides with anything. And
it's actually
there's some power in that, by the way.
Yeah, and it's actually their go-to, and I'll talk about it in the notes. We'll get to it. So it's also the state of being neutral or being unengaged in a dispute or contest between others, the taking of no part on either side in international law specifically, the attitude and condition of a nation or state which does not take part directly or indirectly in a war between other states, but maintains relations of amenity with all the contending parties. And then finally, indifference in quality, a state neither very good nor very evil. So there's a few different interpretations there, but I do think that's important to take in the context of understanding of what we mean when we talk about neutrality. There seems to be almost this knee-jerk reaction when we talk about certain things that are radicalized, be it from theology or social movements, in which neutrality is, it's broad-stroked is bad, and it's not bad. Now, granted, neutrality in all things, to clarify, I don't think is proper. I don't think it's appropriate. But you have to take the circumstance into consideration.
Well, think about the end goal of conflicts. Mm-hmm. Okay, the end goal from one side or the other side is to win.
Yeah.
Right. Or to back off and save face, as a lot of people are talking about today with a particular conflict. Mm-hmm. And think about how that eventuality comes into being. Obliteration often is the end game on one side. But if you want to develop a way to part the conflict, you have to have a party, a quote-unquote neutral party, to help create a compromise. Because if both of opposing parties are conflicted and their ideals are different and ideologies, everything else, then they must have some party in between that takes a nugget from both and says, well, we can do a little of this and a little of that. So the idea of neutrality to have a compromise, heck, the United States of America, the Great Compromise was part of how we established relationships with other countries when we were a young country itself. Mm. And we chose sides all the time. And you don't have to believe in both or believe in none to be neutral. Mm-mm. You just have to require yourself not to take a side.
Yeah.
That's a big difference.
Well, I think that takes a lot of self-control. Now, from a philosophical perspective, neutrality is the tendency not to side in a conflict, physical or ideological, which may not suggest neutral parties do not have a side or are not aware of a side themselves, or on a side themselves. Colloquially, neutral can be synonymous with unbiased. Now, for our listeners and viewers, synonyms for unbiased also include terms such as dispassionate, equal, equitable, even-handed, fair, impartial, indifferent, just, nonpartisan, objective, and unprejudiced. For further clarity, bias is favoritism for some sides, distinct from the tendency to act on that favoritism. Neutrality is distinct, though not exclusive, from apathy, ignorance, indifference, doublethink, equality, agreement, and objectivity. Now, that is sourced from the good old Wikipedia. It's a legitimate source now.
It's a blend of a lot of brains is what that is. And interestingly enough, Wikipedia it's a fun thing to dive into to see how that was created and how it eventually became kind of the mainstream, right? Mm-hmm. So statistically, if you take everybody's ideas and put them on a plate, all the ideas are all over the map, and you put them on a 3-dimensional graph, and you find the medians and the means, and you find where the lines are drawn to put those things together. Yeah. And that is the line of where Wikipedia goes. Mm-hmm. It takes consensus to decide reality. Mm-hmm. Very interesting from a different point of view we had the other day on a podcast, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Consensus is reality.
I just remember the days when Wikipedia was not allowed to be sourced.
Wasn't that funny?
Yeah.
Because you know what's that's you make a good point, because I was just about to bring that up. Obviously, I understand why it was the time, and I believe now you actually have to have some sort of accreditation to actually write.
I think so.
I'm not sure.
But there
don't
comes
quote
the
me on
bias
that.
that we're talking about all the time.
Well,
right?
some qualifications.
If you say the wrong thing on Wikipedia, even if it's your opinion about a particular subject, you're not on Wikipedia.
Typically,
you're changing and skewing the numbers.
Typically, I think you have to actually source something
Yeah, you have to
change
it has to be
whatever it
sourceable.
is on the Wikipedia article.
And I remember the initial argument being, well, anyone could just put anything up there. And, funny enough, that's a really good argument if all other institutions didn't seem to fumble the football when it comes to some of the things they've decided to irreversibly change over the last few years. So obviously there's some interesting bias there that over time just is fun to look back on. But yeah, so specifically in relation to those other adjectives that neutrality, or nouns actually, that neutrality is similar to, distinct from, but similar to. Both apathy and indifference imply carelessness about a subject. Though a person exhibiting neutrality may feel bias, they also may choose not to act on it. Neutral people can be well informed on a subject and need not be ignorant. Neutral people can be biased, so they don't have to feature doublethink, which is accepting both sides as correct, equality, which is viewing both sides as equal, or agreement, a form of group decision-making, so like negotiating a solution on everyone's opinion, including one's own, which may not be unbiased. Additionally, objectivity suggests siding with the more reasonable position, excluding journalistic objectivity. There's a difference, where reasonableness is judged by some common basis between the sides, such as logic, which is thereby avoiding the problem of incommensurability, which is the impossibility to measure or compare due to a lacking common quality required for making a comparison. Neutrality implies tolerance, regardless of how disagreeable, deplorable, or unusual a perspective may be.
Incongruity is a real problem in society today on all levels. And
you mean incommensurability or incongruity?
Well, I'm saying incongruity.
Gotcha.
Because that's what creates
big words.
We have a plethora of big words here at the Wolf and Bull Show. And we also, if you notice, both our names are 4 letters each, which could be conflated with curse words, of course.
Well, in a 4-letter alphabet, those are really big words.
Yes. The entire alphabet all at once. See, I've totally lost where I was going.
Blah.
I'm
incongruity.
My thinking is incongruent at the moment. But the whole idea behind incongruency is that you have 2 different, let's use objects. If we're talking about geometry, you have a circle over here and a triangle over here. Well, they'll never be the same. And you can't. They're not congruent with each other. Mm-hmm. So how do you decide to marry those 2 things together? You have to find commonalities. You have to find where their lines cross. You have to find, I guess circle is a bad thing. I was going to say you have to find where the angles meet.
Well, you turn it upside down, so you're holding the triangle and the circle's on top, and you have an ice cream cone.
Or you figure out, does the triangle fit in the circle, or does the circle fit in the triangle? And so you got to find commonalities within all I'm saying is complicated. Our whole freaking world. This goes back to what we talked about last time.
Don't lose that.
You're
losing the topic. Go back to incongruity.
I'll get coffee in me. I'll come flying back in there. But this whole thing lends itself back to the topics we were talking about the last probably several podcasts.
66 episodes.
Yeah, 66 other episodes. And there is no neutral. That's my line. There is just not. There's no such thing. We're human beings. We're not allowed to. We're not able to. You could find even numbers.
Yeah.
In that if there is something that has no bias, then you could consider it neutral. But we as human beings have them. I don't care what definition you put on it other than that. They just do.
Well,
so it doesn't mean we're going to take a side. We can allow parameters from both sides to be put in place. Benchmarks, watermarks, whatever you want to call it, KPIs, different things to put in place that you cannot go outside of. Mm-hmm. And we will work out our differences in here, inside the building, no matter whether we're on both sides of the aisle or not.
Yeah.
Well, there goes his chances of being a Supreme Court justice.
Yeah. So
back to that. Why is justice blind? What is that trying to tell you when you hear that?
That anyone, if given the proper opportunities and medical help, may eventually be able to see.
It's basically trying to tell you that this is a neutral, I was going to say an edifice. I don't know if that's the right word to use in this, but the whole idea.
Oedipus? Neutral Oedipus?
Well,
is that what you said?
Oedipus the king.
Yes,
was.
We don't need to go.
He was kind of neutral, but I think he liked his mom more than his dad.
A little bit of more of a, yeah.
So anyway,
Freudian.
But he lost his eyes and he went blind. So we're back to justice again.
Yeah.
So, of course, he put his own eyes out, which I don't think justice did. But the whole point is justice is blind because it's supposed to be at the beginning of any confrontation between two parties, plaintiffs and
bailiffs.
Defendants.
Bailiffs. Plaintiffs and defendants. Before any conflict between opposing parties, it is decided that the playing field is neutral.
Yes.
Or at least,
it's supposed to be.
I was going to say objective, but maybe that's the wrong word.
So I agree with you. Fundamentally, I don't think human nature allows for an absolute neutrality. I don't think that's a possibility. I think neutrality is created out of the mutual societal agreement that we have all sort of, kind of agreed to over the last couple thousand years of civilization. I think that's where it comes from. Otherwise, if it didn't come from that area, then we would all be in a whole hell of a lot more problematic scenarios with lack of Bill of Rights and lack of amendments and lack of government and lack of anything. If I remember correctly, I think Alexander Hamilton actually said a strong government allows for the existence of neutrality. Now, it's just paraphrasing. I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that. Look that up yourself.
Federalist Papers.
Federalist Papers? Well, maybe, but no. Hamilton didn't write the Federalist Papers. Madison did.
Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison did.
Oh, yeah.
Hamilton actually wrote the most of them.
I shouldn't question you. You're a big Alexander Hamilton fan.
He wrote most of them while he was in Puerto Rico.
I bet he did, yeah. Sipping out of some tropical drinks and...
You didn't know that, did you?
Imposing his will.
Did you just make that up?
No.
Yeah, you did.
No, I did not.
No, I didn't.
This is the point where we decide whether or not...
Does the audience know?
Was Hamilton in Puerto Rico when he wrote the Federalist Papers?
Or I could hearken back.
During writing
he wrote them all. If you look at the numbers of the chapters of each of his Federalist Papers, you know what each of them are?
Well, before you give that answer though, let's consult the audience. Now, it's been really wonderful having you here as a guest on Who Wants to Be a Quadrillionaire with the Wolf and Bull. And frankly, before you call in one of your helpful guests, or, you can get rid of one of the answers, but we have to read through these 4 answers on whether or not Alexander Hamilton actually wrote the Federalist Papers down in Puerto Rico. First option is no, he didn't. That was a complete lie. Second option is maybe he did, but virtually via Teams. Third option is absolutely not. Who goes to Puerto Rico to write things about federalism? And fourth option, yes, he did. He's Alexander Hamilton, and no one can understand him. You have 60 seconds.
May I phone a friend?
Yes. Go ahead. Bring.
What was the name of the guy that played Alexander Hamilton?
Hey, this is
Lin-Manuel Miranda.
This is Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Are you going to read my right? I blew it.
Did you just have an aneurysm?
Are you going to read me my rights?
Oh.
You know why I said that, right?
Is that your final answer?
Because his name's Miranda. You don't know that it's the Miranda rights, right?
Yes, I know.
And I stuttered on that and sputtered. I've had to... What did you put in this coffee?
Just dumped whiskey into it.
I teed you up in the most awkward way. And you
stumbled. You stumbled over it.
You butt fumbled the joke. You Mark Sanchez yourself all over the place.
All I could think about was the last episode, and you were having a certain type of anxiety, and I was like, "Am I going to have that too?"
Oh, clearly.
Well, I gave you coffee.
Nature's broom.
Oh my gosh. Where were we
poop
before
anxiety.
we went to Puerto Rico?
We were at poop anxiety. He didn't
write them in Puerto Rico.
Oh, we weren't.
He thought about them in Puerto Rico. I have no idea.
Sorry.
No, he was in Puerto Rico. my mind tells me he was Puerto Rico.
Alexander Hamilton.
I don't think so.
In Puerto Rico.
We need to look that up. I'm telling you right now.
Go ahead and
Puerto Rico.
Hey, was it Jeremy? Is that it's not long? It can't be Ben.
Jamie.
Yeah, it can't be Ben anymore. Hey, Jamie, could you go ahead and look that up? Professor X and I over here are talking about whether Alexander Hamilton was in Puerto Rico.
X, it's Xavier.
He was drinking Mai Tais and getting drinks off the back of the.
You did just make that up, didn't you?
You made it up. You totally made it up.
You liar!
Absolutely full of whatever's going to be coming out of you later.
Now, anyone who knows the answers,
did not make it up.
I don't know about that.
Is the bull lying? A, absolutely. B, not sure. C, potentially. Or D, no comment.
Or
we'll give you 30 seconds.
Or could he be driving a Lincoln?
Yeah. We can't reference old jokes. We gotta be fresh. We gotta be fresh.
Well, I was
fresh.
going. You know where I was going?
Like
with
my poop anxiety.
With the fresh.
Fresh. Like
I
my
don't
poop.
want to think about your poop anxiety being
fresh.
fresh.
Poop. Anyway,
I was talking about each one of those Federalist Papers numbers was prime. Why
I'm stopping you. No, I'm stopping you.
It's been weeks and weeks and weeks since I referenced that.
Now, I mentioned that neutrality implies tolerance, and tolerance is
apparently the wolf is not neutral.
Yeah, no. Tolerance is the capacity for or the practice of recognizing and respecting the beliefs or practices of others. I recognize and I respect your beliefs and practices. I respect your jokes.
You are lying. You're a bald-faced liar. Or you're a bold-faced liar.
Hey.
Or you're a hairy-faced liar.
He's a hairy-faced liar.
In large dentures.
What's the one term that our POTUS says? You're a bald-faced lion pony soldier.
Man.
But
you're a pony soldier.
You're a bald-faced lion pony soldier. But yeah, regarding moderation and mediation, neutrality champions the facilitation of dialogue independent of bias, emphasizing process over outcome, and these parties are often perceived as more trustworthy, reliable, and safe.
Unlike the bull, who totally lied about Puerto Rico.
I'm telling you.
Liar!
Hey.
You're lying.
Why did you believe him?
Why would I lie?
He wasn't in Puerto Rico.
Why would I lie about it?
You know what? I'm just going to look stupid at this point, so I'm going to drop the subject. Dropping it flat on its face. We're not going to bring it up again.
Is Beowulf, does she look dumb in this instance?
Oh, you better watch it, Wolf.
Yes. B, afraid to answer. C, decline your question. And D, absolutely not. She's right in every instance. Correct answer is D. Yes, is D. But yeah, on a side note, by the way,
yes,
the bias of neutrality itself, if you didn't know, is the expectation upon the Swiss government, so it was Switzerland, in armed neutrality, and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies related to non-interventionism. So, yeah.
So they had a side.
Themselves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, some of them were pacifists. Some of them just believed there should be no conflict. Whatever. If
and
you
some
have
of them
a
are
problem
Swiss.
with each other, just don't do anything about it. I don't know.
Would you could you say, like, I'm going to do whatever is best for me as a sign of neutrality? So I'll lean this way, that way, whichever way, go with the wind.
Obviously, you're not supposed to explicitly state that. I think it's implicit for a lot of people.
Well, let's think about the Swiss Army, right? And why they would want to be, neutral.
Or better yet, let's think of Swiss cheese.
Or let's
why does it have holes?
A Swiss watch. They're always on time. If there is such a thing.
What about a Swiss bank account?
That was great comedic timing.
That was good.
I really liked it.
That was really good.
I did.
So
I wish I had one.
So the Swiss.
I could put all my crypto in there.
So the Swiss.
In a crypt.
Yeah.
So the Swiss. You were saying.
Yes.
Swiss cheese.
Oh, he lost it.
He lost it.
Say anything. You did.
Coffee doesn't help at all.
You did. You were bringing up Swiss cheese.
Now he's projecting Swiss cheese.
I said Swiss Army. Think of the Swiss Army.
That's what I'm saying.
Why do you think they wanted to be neutral?
Because it was smart.
For
them.
Swiss.
They were in the middle of the conflict.
How is that neutral?
I mean, they're
That was
literally smack in the middle of
self-preservation is
everything.
what that is.
Well,
That's all that is.
Don't they border Germany, France?
Of course they do. The German army had to go basically
Italy?
around all their mountains to get to France to conquer it every
And
5 years.
Switzerland's like, leave us alone.
Swiss is like,
And we'll leave you alone.
We're neutral.
Now, here's the real
We'll
observation.
feed you some cheese.
Who
We'll give you
came
some
out?
army knives.
Who came out of that least scathed?
Switzerland.
I'm
Unfortunately.
not saying that's wrong. I'm
mean,
just saying
not-
that the
not
idea of
unfortunate.
neutrality
You know what I
is in this case is self-preservation.
Of course.
In the case of the Red Crescents and the Red Cross,
Of course.
they have a position on how they look at things. In case of a referee in a football game,
Well,
or
but
a basketball game,
so I get it, but I think, and I think that that's apparent. I think it's something that's true. I guess my position on this, I'm trying to be neutral here.
He's
my
become
position
a
on
crafted
this.
politician over
I
here.
have my position on this is that the idea that neutrality itself is impossible, which I'm not saying you're suggesting, but the idea that it is impossible for people, I think, is wholly incorrect. I think it's something that we can engage within, but it's based upon what we deem to be contextually appropriate.
He has a
thus
career in
engaging
politics. He has told me I'm right and wrong in the same sentence, not the same paragraph, the same sentence.
It was a run-on sentence,
Well, okay.
a paragraph.
So what's
Well,
the
if you have
difference?
poop anxiety, then it could be.
Stop referencing my insecurities.
What's the difference between being a neutral person because you truly, or person, in this case we're talking about country, but just in
Talk
general.
about person. Go back to person because country's more. It's more litigation oriented.
So what's the difference between being truly a neutral person in the sense of you just don't care either way, as it said,
That's apathetic.
That's not neutral.
No,
It's
like
apathetic.
dispassionate about either side, or being maybe they do care, but they're going to be self-preserving their own self-interest, so they'll hold back from making decisions. That way.
Self-control.
Well, think about this for a second, maybe, and I'll go off into my space frontier here. And what was the prime directive? Right?
The Prime Directive?
Yeah.
Is this a Battlestar Galactica reference?
Oh
What are
my
we-
God, frackin' A. No,
I love that show.
I do too. No, the that's from Star Trek. The Prime Directive.
Oh yeah, sorry, I
You don't have to be a boomer to like
To
Star Trek.
spread
Come on.
your seed amongst the stars.
Our
Go where no one has gone before. They used to say where no man's gone
To
before.
spread
They don't do
the
that
seed amongst the stars. is
Our
the
Star
Prime
Trek
Directive.
is Chris Pine and Benedict Cumberbatch. That's
anymore.
our
even
Star
that,
Trek.
even that's
In Benedict
like
Cumberbatch.
12.
And-
how long ago was that? 12 years ago, something like
8
that.
years ago.
Feels like it. I don't know.
Anyway, but the whole Prime Directive was something in Star Trek where you could go and visit all these planets, but don't mess around. Doesn't matter what's going on the planet, who's conflicting with who's
Well, and they
dying
broke that.
off,
They
who's-
broke that all the time.
I didn't say they didn't.
Yeah.
I'm saying the directive
Yeah.
was designed for neutrality.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't, that's really not even the right word, because they could look at something going on, planet A.
Zagnar.
Zagnar. I like
With
that
the-
one.
with the
That was one
Zagnar-
of my favorite episodes.
With the
as a matter of fact.
Zagnarians and the Blarfagans.
Blarfagans. That's the Woozles and the Huffalumps.
Yeah, well, they were also the other factions on that planet as well. The Zagnarians,
Yes,
the
the
Blofferans,
Zagnarians
and the
were wiping out the
Blagnarians.
Balloonifats, whatever they were. They were wiping them off the face.
The Bluefiodians?
Because the Bluefiodians were too slow, and the Zagnarians.
Zagnaracs.
Zagnaracs?
Yeah.
The Zagnaracs were quick.
Yeah.
Right? So they were catching up to the Bluefiodians all the time.
Well, see,
they were wiping them out.
their bellies would drag along the ground, though,
Captain
so-
Kirk up there was like, we got to save the Blofarians.
Yeah, because the Zagnarats
are a bunch of
jerks.
jerks, man.
Yeah.
We need to do something about it. And Spock was like, no.
This sounds like an L.
That's
Ron
not a
Hubbard
logical thing to
book.
do.
Shout out Hot B, L. Ron Hubbard. I'm crying.
Battlefield Earth.
Yeah, right. So so to answer your question, after we talked about the Zagnarakians,
We have no idea what happened to the Zagnarakians now.
well, the Narakians were an older version of the Zagnaraks.
Zagnaraks.
You're thinking third. You're thinking third iteration here. It's the fourth age, and the Zagnarakians no longer exist. The
fourth
Zagnaraks,
age?
yeah. And Frodo was with Sauron fighting. It was fighting Darth Vader in Mount Doom on top of Battlestar Galactica. It was great. It was great. Dude.
Just let me know when Dumbledore shows up.
Well, I think he's already,
well, the Balrog killed him, so.
Balrog, yes. Exactly.
I'm literally crying. That was the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. And I'm gonna write a book about it. But yeah, I think to answer your question, did
I have a question in there?
No, to Jen's question, or shit. Well, God, we got to start all over. Beowulf's question, Jen. We're on the other show. They know our names. Everyone knows. To answer your question, I think what actually makes someone neutral as opposed to self-interested is, one, whether they know something about the topic. He's thinking about the Zagnarakians. I've ruined it. He's been thinking about it. The Blarfigans and the Zagnarakians, the killing of the Woozlewolves, and the Woozlewolves, and he's thinking about all that. I don't even know how we continue from this point, but I think it's self-interest, and then it's actually knowing about the subject itself. Because if I take on a discussion between you two and I don't know anything about the subject, and I'm telling you both that you're both correct, and I'm operating within groupthink. Neutrality is actually understanding what the subject is about, having a merited opinion about it, but deciding not to operate on a basis of bias up until it is required. We can't have a serious conversation anymore because he's done. He's done. He's dying.
He's got the giggles.
We can't. He's dying. He's literally dying. I shouldn't have pulled up. I should not have whipped out the Zagnarakians. He's got
this picture of the Zagnarats.
Yep. We'll see what they are. Is they're half squirrel, half dolphin hybrids they're bipeds. They're bipedal, but they look like dolphins merged with squirrels. So it's very interesting.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
I got to get us back on track here. We've been in Star Wars.
Not Star Wars. Star Trek.
Land.
No, Harry Lord of the Star
the whole
Galactic
point is they never followed the prime directive. Rarely followed their prime directive.
Star Trek.
They
not
always
the
tried to change things and model things because they had their own point of view. And everybody has their point of view. We're all human.
Yeah.
We all have bias. We like to take this center lane. And I think the only way you can even get close to that center lane is logic.
Well, what's interesting is on episode 420, specifically at time base 69 in Star Trek, 42069, specifically at that episode, Captain Kirk was looking at one of the Zagnarakians as he was bleeding out, and he realized that the Zagnarakians were only bad because they operated within the moral construct of moral relativism, and it really corrupted their society.
I was done going on about it. He just up to the edge of the cliff.
Mm.
Well, see, the Black Narfians, though. So neutrality obviously has a lot of criticisms in society, as we've referenced earlier in the episode, before all collectively having aneurysms and losing our minds. It's only 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock or something like that. So early for us. Now, all of the above about, and by that I mean everything we've talked about neutrality may seem fine and dandy, but the philosophy of neutrality has been heavily criticized. Neutrality has been criticized as an unethical option. The argument being that the neutral option can, directly or indirectly, end up favoring those who harm others or maintain a state of injustice. Per your reference of, you're either with us or against us. Sorry. IPA burp. IPA burp.
It sounded like you're siding with the Blarfonians.
Yeah, the Blarfgoffians. It was good.
Burponians.
Yeah, the Burponians were a separate...
They came in from another planet.
Well, they were a neutral faction that was actually from a impartial planet destroyed by a recent nuclear explosion.
By the way, this is
imposed by the
I think
entities
this is
that
what
were in
people
Star
do
Trek.
when they sit around on like the back rooms of Saturday Night Live or some of these comedy shows from the 80s and stuff that were all stupid.
Well, they just
made up shit and
they made a bunch. They had a bunch of drugs too.
Back when they were funny.
Yeah,
there was a whole 2 or 3 movies called The Coneheads.
Yeah,
do you remember that?
I do.
That came from a Saturday Night Live skit. So did the Blues Brothers.
Mm-hmm. That was a great movie.
That was a great movie.
Yeah, Coneheads, not so much. Blues
no,
Brothers,
it wasn't. But
very funny.
How do you get 2 or 3 movies out of something?
Beowulf has no idea what we're talking about.
No.
Yeah.
At all.
at all.
You don't need to. Trust me. It's nothing. It's not like, hey, you got to go see this classic. It's called The Coneheads.
Yeah.
Jeez, what do their heads look like?
Well, it's like that movie. It's like that.
Blarphonians.
It's like the movie Strange Brew. Shout out Strange Brew podcast.
That's right.
I love that movie, but it's kind of the similar lane of hilarity that no longer exists because people can't be creative. So yeah, obviously now there's a very particular individual who I have criticisms of that is also very critical of neutrality. Italian writer Dante Alighieri, writer, author of the Divine Comedy. He says in Canto 3 that people and angels, he said that in Canto, not Encanto, not the Disney movie.
I was thinking the Disney movie?
In Canto 3, that people and angels that who were not rebels nor faithful to their God but stood apart were condemned to being stung eternally by wasps and gadflies. Quote, the darkest place in hell is reserved for those who maintain their neutrality in times of moral crisis. Now keep in mind, moral crisis. So
why do you
extremes.
hate that, though?
I don't hate that at all.
You just said you hated him.
No, criticize. I've criticized him. I didn't say I hate him. I said I have criticisms of him because he's never been to hell.
How do you know?
I guess you don't.
We don't. How do we know L. Ron?
Obviously,
how do we know
what he's saying.
How do we know L. Ron Hubbard isn't a Thetan?
It's Thetan, by the way, not Thetan.
Well, that rhymes with Satan. It's a little too negative. And then obviously Theodore Roosevelt, quoting Dante's work in his America and World War in 1915, said Dante reserved a special place of infamy in the inferno for those base angels who dared side neither with evil nor with good. South African priests, go ahead.
You're either with me or against me, right?
Yes, very similar. But then again, he's talking about World War.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But the reason, I got to be careful about this.
Mm-hmm.
My point, I'll let you think about it. My point is measurable differences. World War, obviously, unless you're the Swiss, they had a secret. It was called the Alps. It's a beautiful place.
They said in 2022 we're going to have so many reels and TikToks of this place. We have to keep it as beautiful
like that
as
one
possible.
Place, is the roller coaster thing in the Alps? Yeah, that. Oh my God. Well done, Alps, Swiss, cheese. Chocolate. Thanks. I mean, I think that obviously not everyone can be neutral when it comes to things like that. And I think that's what's important to remember is that in times of moral crisis, obviously you shouldn't be neutral if you can't.
But see, the neutrality about these subjects, our view on the obviously part about it is all historical.
True, but I don't think it was irrelevant at the time.
I don't think it's irrelevant either.
Yeah.
You can be on the right side or the wrong side of history all over the place. And if the wrong side, quote unquote, from our current point of view wins, then 100 years from now, it'll look like it was the right side.
Yeah, well,
that's kind of my point. And the only ones that kind of know the difference are the logical, neutral ones in between. Mm-hmm. And I use that neutral phrase because I don't believe. Obviously, I've made my point. I don't believe in the neutrality of any of this.
Yeah,
I think anybody that is neutral, not picking a side is choosing. Right?
I don't think that's
making a choice.
Yeah, but I don't think the implication is that you shouldn't choose a side. I think the implication is you withhold bias from either extreme.
Correct, but that's external.
It can be internal too.
No, you can't. If you have internal biases, they're there.
Yeah, but you can. There's plenty of people that don't act on prejudice.
That's external.
Yeah,
I'm talking about internal biases.
No, I understand
are there.
Where you're going. Okay, gotcha.
So the whole point I'm making is if you have an internal bias of any kind whatsoever,
but
it's going to taint your ability to create that compromise that supposely is the reason for being neutral.
Well, maybe. I mean, maybe it might taint it. But if you choose to act on it in a fair manner, which neutrality is a synonym of fairness, then it won't taint it. I think it's a matter of self-control. I think if you sit down with somebody, if I sit down with you and I sit down with you, Beowulf, and I watch you guys have a disagreement and I witness a disagreement, and my ultimate goal, because I think that's what is important in this instance, is peace and, friendship amongst you two and all three of us. I would obviously take a position that is moderate. Right?
That's fine, but I would tell anybody that's talking about this that there is no way in the context of us three that any one of us could be neutral in a conflict between two of us. So you'd have to, as it's impossible from my point of view in this.
Well, maybe in this circumstance.
So you know what you have to do?
Maybe in this
you have to
circumstance.
hire an outside
mediator,
independent counsel.
Yes. So, but
arbitration.
So I guess a mediator. So I understand. I guess my point, that was probably a little too personal of an example. I just mean it in the sense that there obviously throughout history have been multiple instances where people have been able to be neutral. They just chose to control themselves. I think so. 100%.
Tell me.
One instance?
Yeah. The only reason we talk right now,
I would say,
about historical figures
entirely, the justice system entirely, fair representation, 100%.
And you could go online and watch thousands and thousands of things about how biased that system really is.
Yeah, but that's nitpicking.
It doesn't matter if it's nitpicking.
Of course
the reason people come up with those points of view is they believe whoever made that decision, that judge.
Okay, but then we're talking about the same thing that we've argued about in relation to situations of the last 2 years. People focusing on the actual minutia as opposed to the grand whole of things.
It doesn't matter.
It does.
Bias changes the direction of something.
I'm not saying
real it or not.
I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm saying, and I don't necessarily know if bias innately does that. I would say the act upon that bias does that.
Correct. But even if you don't act upon the bias, if it's revealed in any way, shape, or form ever from now until forever that you had as the arbiter of this disagreement, any kind of bias,
okay,
then historically, whatever decisions were made that you were the basis of that neutrality are gone. In retrospect.
So in the instance that it isn't, because, for example...
How would it not be?
Sometimes people have thoughts that they keep themselves. We all have internal biases. Just because I see someone on the street doesn't mean that I'll ever tell anyone or ever say anything about that particular bias that I may hold about that circumstance or perception. That's internalized human nature. Just because we have a thought doesn't mean it's an actual thing.
Isn't it?
Not necessarily.
An actual thing. The thought.
I mean,
what does a thought do?
Well, that's a whole different conversation. But
my point is the same. If there is no, you're saying you can put a barrier between your internal inspection of what you believe and don't believe, and it does not cross that barrier to whatever the actions are that you take or whatever your suggestions are.
I don't think it's common, but I think it's possible. Yes.
See, I disagree. Because I think...
Then how do you have any measure of self-control, ever?
Self-control does not mean you don't have bias.
It just means you don't act upon
it. Even if you don't act upon it, your psychology tilts you one way or another.
Sure, but there's been plenty of instances in which... Because this is the nature versus nurture argument. There's been plenty of instances in which people have been total outliers from what they've been raised up in, from what people have determined to be where they should have been based on where they were raised.
Let me ask you. So if you have an internal bias of some sort, and I don't have a good
Is this
example.
a heavy bias or is this a prejudice that people normally have just in fleeting thoughts?
I don't know if it even matters.
Like, do I go home and I worship a shrine about this bias? Like, or do I have a fleeting thought that I would never act upon ever?
You're a wolf.
Okay.
And you have wolfly biases.
So there's
I'm a bull and I have bully biases. You're a Baal wolf.
And you have biases against certain
Irish virus,
certain monsters that you kill.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Grindel.
Grindelwald.
Oh, Grindelwald. You're right.
No,
it's Grindel.
Grindelwald's from Harry Potter.
No, the monster Beowulf killed was Grindel, wasn't it?
No,
the green one. I'm pretty sure it was Grindel.
Oh my God, why do I not know it?
Pretty sure it was Grindel.
I don't remember.
Beowulf killed. Yeah, I think you're right.
Hey, Jamie, could you go ahead and look up what the monster was that was murdered by Beowulf?
I think the monster that they found in Beowulf was in Puerto Rico, by the way.
Yeah, were they writing the Federalist Papers? Anyway, back to
Grindel.
Your nature.
Grindel.
Your nature as a wolf is to distract, and while you're doing that, your other compatriots are circling me, and I don't even know it.
The Thetans, you're right, they are. They're all
the
around
other
you.
wolves, the ghost wolves in the background, in the woods trying to
we
attack.
made it clear that I'm a lone wolf. Better for narrative purposes.
So my whole point is there are things in our nature. There's biological aspects to how we are as people, and then there's circumstantial aspects that change as we grow and we think and we learn and we change over time. So all of those things affect the way we view everything. So there is no pure neutral way for me to view opposing issues.
Yeah, but I think that
I have bias.
I think you're taking this position as if there needs to be a pure position in order for it to be neutrality. I think there's no such thing as true neutrality. Just like I think there's
I'm saying.
Just like I think there's no such thing as true truth, because that's a cyclical argument that's pedantic. There's no answer to it. Right? Because then we're going into the alternative of moral relativism and moral absolutism is where we're going.
What you're talking about is perception of truth versus truth. There is neutral, but not from our personal perceptions. Okay?
But it still means we could operate within it in a restrained way.
No, I'm saying from a personal point of view, your idea of truth, your idea of neutral, your idea of bias, your idea of all these different things has, as we've talked about a million times, a personal filter on it.
Of course it does.
That personal filter alters the way you think about something. That doesn't necessarily change how you're going to act. Yeah, but it may change it actually in the opposite direction. Because if you're thinking, oh, I side with France over Germany, so I don't want to show any bias. I want to prove that I'm neutral, so I'm going to give Germany this extra thing in this compromise that we're putting together. You see what I'm saying? You changed...
Or better yet, we can take it down to an actual relative point. You're a parent and you have two kids, and you don't want to show one more favoritism than the other. So you play the neutral role of not playing sides in an instance where they're both bickering. You be the parent. That is actual neutrality, right?
Okay. And I'm a parent. I also have siblings. I guarantee you, when my brother and I were squabbling over things when I was a kid, there were certain ways that I was viewed, certain ways he was viewed. And it's based on personality. It's based on historical things that have occurred. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't punish us the same or not punish us the same.
I'm not saying that.
Okay. So my viewpoint of those historical events were that they were trying very hard to be neutral with whatever situation has occurred.
And based off of my observation of that,
based on my recollection of a lot of instances, I got to go read my book, and my brother got to go to his room.
Yeah, I'm just, but I'm.
Does that give you any indication of
maybe? But that's also like the only reason I'm saying that is because we talk about the freaking thing you brought up from Star Trek. You dang
prime
nerd.
Directive.
The prime directive. It doesn't mean that you have to be perfect. It means it's a guideline. So neutrality, in an effort to try and make sure that there is peace, in a lot of ways, would be what we strive for if we're wanting to live in a world that has
about a guideline,
lack of conflict.
fine.
That's what I'm getting at. I'm not getting at the fact that people can, like, there's no Spock, okay? I understand that, like, this is all bullshit.
Spock wasn't very neutral anyway.
I understand, but
he was in battle with himself all the time.
Yeah, well, it's because of his haircut.
He had a human mother,
right,
and a Vulcan father.
Maybe the Vulcans were the
You
problem.
would know that if you were a Star Trek geek.
I do know that. I just don't like quoting it because it makes me look unique.
Unfortunately, he's only seen Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yeah, I'll quote
playing that character.
I'll quote my Zagnarkians fantasy trilogy anthology that I'm writing. So I guess my point is not that people are absolute either way. I just mean that if you're striving to be neutral, I think it is possible. You're just not absolute neutral. Just like I don't think you can be absolutely black or absolutely white when it comes to good or bad.
Then you're making my point. Thank you very much.
Wrong. Incorrect.
Hold it. Mic drop.
Incorrect.
How is that incorrect?
Because neutrality exhibits the world is gray argument. Right?
No.
Yes, it does.
No.
Of course it does.
No, because the closer you get to gray, the more you understand gray as a combination of what?
Both. But you don't take either side, or you'd be black or white.
I didn't say you take either side.
I'm not saying you did.
We're arguing semantics now.
No, we're not. We're arguing
arguing about everything.
Pedantics.
Pedantic semantics.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of other criticisms.
Fish.
Yeah, we should talk about the other criticisms. I'll just say a few quotes. South African. Southwest is a plane. South African priest Desmond Tutu said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Woodrow Wilson, neutrality is a negative word. It does not express what America ought to feel. We are not trying to keep out of trouble. We are trying to preserve the foundations on which peace may be rebuilt. Lajos Kossuth, governor-president of the Kingdom of Hungary from 1848 to 1849, said neutrality as a lasting principle is evidence of weakness. And then Max Eastman, American writer on literature, philosophy, and society, also a political activist, quote-unquote, people who demand neutrality in any situation are usually not neutral but in favor of the status quo. And then finally, Elie Wiesel, American writer of Night, his experience as a Jewish prisoner in Auschwitz, professor, political activist, Nobel laureate. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And then the Huffington Post, specifically in their recent article about how being neutral about anything is an example of prejudice and racism, is why neutrality is just as harmful as prejudice. But this, again, goes back to my point of context and extremes. If we're talking about the Holocaust, historically, the people in that area of the world who were not SS Gestapo did not know that that was going on. Had they have known, I can assure you, no one would have picked the sides of the Nazis. I don't think they would have. I think it would have been a minority. Same thing with any form of genocide, but that is an extreme. But if we're talking about a cyclical argument of people's innate desire to either continue to be ignorant towards each other and not know anything about each other and learn anything about each other, or B, be prejudiced because they want to be douchebags, there's no such thing as a side in that area, because it's a cyclical argument that is only solved by people's chosen decisions to grow up. That's what it comes down to. That's what's happening right now, is people asking us to be on sides of pointlessness. That's where I'm getting at. Is if I'm talking about humanity and the existence of an entire race of people, or humans in general, or animals, or the preservation of the earth, those are extreme arguments that anyone would be ridiculous to be neutral in. Either you're on it or you're against it. But if it's something to do with whether I like, I don't know, a coffee shop because they happen to be outspoken during a certain period of time, who cares? Who cares? And that's my point. Neutrality shouldn't exist in that area. And if it does, when it comes to in the area of extremes, it shouldn't exist. But if it does in the area of pointlessness, that's because you're trying to stay out of a dumb argument.
Yeah. I go ahead, Bale.
Oh, no. Please. Go.
No, after you. No. I'm trying to be very neutral about this.
After you. I'm in the gray. Neutral.
You guys are so polite.
You're very polite. But, the problem now is that everybody's trying to draw this line of black and white all the time. And I'm not talking...
Well, they're manipulating.
Just really, really fast. I also think it depends on, you've been talking about extremes, with, extreme stuff of World War II and stuff. And then you also brought up the coffee shop thing. Mm-hmm. I think there's just a lot of people who it doesn't matter to them personally, and other people may get upset. I'm not talking about the extremes right now. I'm talking about the coffee shop thing. Yes. This coffee shop does this during this period of time. I know you're thinking of this because I currently have a mug with that coffee shop on it.
Look, by the way, I'm not criticizing the coffee shop. I'm saying that in the broad scheme of things, much like our discussion about time in our recent episodes, and really in anything, because we'll eventually tackle the object of truth. That's on our list, which is an interesting one. There's things that matter, and then there's things that are self-imposed stupidity.
Well, it's also something that really matters to one person and probably does affect their life in a big way. To this other family, for example, it's not even on their radar. They've got this other huge problem that's their number one thing.
And the question that I have for people who want you to join their cause is, what is the end goal of that cause? If I join your cause by posting a square that shows nothing, which I did not do, sure as hell happy I didn't do that, because I waited. I played the neutral game.
Hot take.
Well, that's part of it.
Just saying.
That's a psychological problem.
Is it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it truly is. Not for everybody. For everybody, some people are justifiably angry about something in their lives.
And they should be.
And they have I would like to call it a psychotic break, but it's not. It's transference. Mm-hmm. You have anxiety of some kind and you transfer it on others. For whatever reason becomes your cause. Part of that is, it's kind of like the story I talked about the other day with the cash register gal.
Yes. Good old Ray Ann.
She was like that because she needed
to be a cold-hearted bitch.
She wasn't. She was very nice.
I know. I'm joking.
But to most people, she was not. And to me, she was not for a while. It's because she didn't see value in herself.
Yeah.
And when people don't see value in themselves, they look outside of themselves to determine where their value belongs. They take on causes. Nothing wrong with taking on causes. Don't get me wrong when I say this. I think it's great to build yourself and build things around you.
Yes.
For the betterment of all of us. I think that's wonderful. And I can disagree with you and still admire the fact that you want to do something outside of your own circle. And I talk about my own circle all the time. But the fact of the matter is that a great deal of people that do that aren't doing it for altruistic reasons. They're doing it because they have a problem in themselves. They see no worth and value in themselves.
Or they see
have
too
to
much.
Criticize others to raise themselves up.
Or they see too much value in themselves.
Falsely.
Not to them.
If they pulled back the curtain on themselves, which is what people really need to do to be introspective, they would see that there's something missing.
True.
And they would see that they're propping themselves up to this on this pedestal that they don't belong on, because none of us do. And they're doing it so they have a feeling of self-importance. And to modify that, they need to gather a group of like-minded people all on the same terrible psychological train to force their viewpoint on somebody else.
Well, yeah, and I think that that's a viable point. Now, we've talked about the criticisms of neutrality. We're going to talk about a few additional views because I think it gives them a little bit more insight. In Supreme Court decisions, Southworth versus Board of Regents of the University of Wisconsin system, based on the United States Constitution's First Amendment, the court decided some funding decisions should be made through a neutral viewpoint. Hopefully they decide that again when it comes to, what was the one, Yale? The Yale one that's in the Supreme Court right now. And then Oxford English Dictionary documents that by at least 1897, neutral meant applying the rules to the facts. As in football, your point earlier, neutral linesmen shall officiate in all games. Now, I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a PE teacher. I'm not a politician. I'm not
a
an
podcaster.
author. I'm not an artiste. I'm not a painter. I'm not a musician. Actually, that is true. I am a musician to some degree. I'm a podcaster. And I believe that engaging in honest neutrality means a few different things. Of course, my co-host hates my position and he will not agree with me. So I'm a victim now. I'm a podcasting victim.
Damn it, Jim. I'm a podcaster.
Not a biologist. Number one, neutrality can pave the way for diplomatic solutions. Number two, though distinct from objectivity, I believe that taking an initially neutral position on hyperbolic arguments, not moral calls for assistance, but hyperbolic arguments, allows for a thorough analysis of given data. Neutrality eliminates appeals to emotional fallacy, it prevents radicalization, moral relativism, and ethical fading, and it also attempts to humanize a position before demonizing. Doesn't mean it will not inevitably demonize. It just means that it attempts to early on. I don't think that it is a position per your position, which I think is correct, that you can hold indefinitely. I don't think you can. I just think it is something that you can engage in preemptively in order to learn a little bit about the situation, in order to prevent a cycle of echo chamber that people seem to find themselves in all the time.
Okay. So you said something a moment ago. And it was, I think, the Supreme Court decision, or no, the Oxford English Dictionary documents that for over 120 years now, neutral has been applying rules to the facts, as in football, you mentioned. So here's where we align.
Yeah.
Okay. What I've been arguing about for the last hour is this human element that we throw into everything. And it bogs down the system. It's a cog in the machine, right? And it needs to be eliminated from the machine. Because if we want to think about things logically, mathematically, geometrically, however you want, that is definitive. And what I mean is it has a certain definition right now that can be not unchangeable.
It has boundary conditions.
Thank you. And you used that term last time. I think it's a great term. So there are boundary conditions that we agree. If you're inside this boundary and you're adhering to these 10 rules, whatever they are, that is our definition right now of a neutral situation.
Yes.
And if we can come in together, these opposing parties, and use this, even though a human is arbitrating that we get together inside these rules and parameters, it's neutral. Mm-hmm. Now, those parameters, those questions, those answers, those KPIs, they might change at some point down the line. Supreme Court might change them. Doctrine might change them. Wikipedia might change them, for God's sakes, in the future. Mm-hmm. But for right now, there's a lane.
Yeah.
And if you're inside that lane, that is neutral. And if you're willing to play by these rules, that is the neutrality zone. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's anything wrong with taking that position at all. I'm right in the same place you are.
Well, and I think, because we talk about human nature all the time. You know what's not within human nature? The last 100 or so years that we've existed? That's not common in all of humanity, to have some sort of level of representation of rights and some level of open discussion and some level of consideration of people who are outside of the norm. That's not normal in all of human history. Neither is neutrality. It's not normal within human nature. So my whole point being is, if we are to transcend to become better versions of humans, whether it be, in the possibly ethical way where we don't meld with machines, or in the Elon Musk, Bill Gates way, in which we become part machine, part human, which innates, a destruction of our own humanity, but that's another topic eventually. Whether we do either of those things, at the end of the day, neutrality is not natural, to your point. It's not. It's not natural. People don't get together and say, how can I benefit the other party across from me while also benefiting myself? They don't naturally say that, which is why within this civil circle we've created, through natural occurrence and through luck and through a myriad of different societal impacts and influence, that in and of itself is unique. And that's my point. And
frankly, I hope you're wrong about one of the things you said. And what that is that you said this time period over the last 100, 200 years of this experiment.
Hopefully it's not
this
rare.
Thing that we generously call freedom today. Mm-hmm. And that keeps changing and morphing before our very eyes is very rare. I remember watching someone, this was 20 years ago, Doug Weed, pretty famous, passed recently, by the way, but pretty famous historian / counselor to a couple of presidents, wrote books about presidents and their children. But he was an incredible historian, unbelievable storyteller. But he was mentioning one time at a conference I was at how, matter of fact, this is how he did it. I'm going to paraphrase, but he had the conference lights in the hall turned off. And we were in a hotel with, I don't know, maybe there was 1,000 people there or something like that. And he lit a lighter. And he went on to tell this story for the next 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, about how this, and I didn't let the light go the whole time, probably would have burned himself doing that, but he was lit a candle. I don't remember entirely. But basically what he went into was how this is what freedom in the context of history really looks like. It's a single light in a huge, vast, dark room.
Same thing with peace.
And it could go out anytime.
Yeah. And history
has most of the time.
Well, history would suggest that it will again. And that's the unfortunate reality.
But this is why I say I hope you're wrong. Because that viewpoint is only changed through a whole lot more history being created. In the way we're starting to develop freedom, peace today.
Supposedly.
And I've lived long enough to think, when I was a kid, I had these ideas. Number one, that we'd be doing a podcast like this from a space station or from the moon by the time I was this age.
We're on a space station. What are you talking about?
You know what I'm saying.
You never know what could happen.
By the way. We are. What?
So you never know what could happen.
Absolutely. But the point is, by the time we went into the 21st century, I thought we were going to be flying in cars, have space stations and all that kind of stuff going on, because that was the direction. That was this huge emotional and scientific push in that direction, which disappeared for 50 plus years.
Because aliens are on the other side of the moon.
Possibly. Who knows? According to the weird ass movie I saw the other day, the moon is something else entirely. Which would be fun.
Moonfall?
I loved that movie so much.
Moonfall? Is that, that's what's called, right?
Wait.
It was awesome.
Stop. Remember the part where he's...
Of course, anything with
remember the part... Spoiler. Remember the part when he's in the hotel in L.A.
Yes.
And just the city is just destroyed around him?
Yes.
I was crying laughing on the plane when that happened. Because
that was pretty much a shot from today.
Well, I guess... hilarious. I guess the point that I was getting at with that whole thing is he rides up looking all cool, and all of L.A. is just in shambles. The buildings are on fire. It's entirely flooded. People are screaming in the background. And the president basically, and I'm paraphrasing this, says, "God damn it, Bill, we need you." And he does this. I mean, I got to find my son. And it's like the end of all of humanity. And he's just like, yeah, well, I got to work out this argument and disagreement over a Camaro with my son and
That's
I.
right. He's in jail right now, if I remember right.
I'm like,
he was speeding.
Yeah, that's what happened. I laughed so hard. But yeah, back to the space thing and the emotional appeal to go up into space that has completely disappeared because aliens are the other side of the moon.
Right. No, all I'm saying is that there was a time when I thought a lot more was going to happen than has happened today. So, the future's unwritten. I don't know where I was going with that though. The whole thing with Doug and everything that he was doing at the conference was, I just thought that was very illustrative of the way we should really think about this moment in time. And I get frustrated to no ends by people that want to use their voices, their emotions, their conflict, their silence is violence stuff, or their loud violence. I get so frustrated by that because they forget that our ability to even talk and be like this stems from that very small flickering flame that could go out at any time by the same people that flame gave the freedom to.
Well, and I think that's what I'm getting at with the neutrality aspect is I know that maybe I'm utilizing it in a creative way, but I'm tired of broad stroke statements. I'm tired of people making these assumptions and these statements specifically in relation to, one, things you're mentioning, and two, the relation to things when it comes to neutrality as if it's unethical. I think making a statement such as being neutral, saying that it's unethical is just as unethical as implying, without any available proof, that those engaging in fair-mindedness are, as opposed to being clearly biased, is also unethical. I think they're both unethical. If you want to take that position, the supposition that you're making is an unethical supposition. And I would consider an assumption about the ethics of those who engage in appropriate neutrality without context a hasty generalization. Because you don't know what that person is coming from. You don't know what observation they have. You don't know what data they have on the topic that you're discussing. You don't know how well-versed they are. They could be more well-versed on the topic than you are. And it might be more intelligent to be neutral about it. Now, I think many individuals who make an assertion, now obviously from my research, this is my personal bias here, are either survivors of terrible events. So they should make statements such as that. In those cases, neutrality can be seen as negative, as long as the context is clearly understood. Or they're political activists, writers, or journalists, or grifters. And a funny thing about the unethical observation, which is very common about neutrality, is that being quote-unquote unethical literally is not conforming to approved standards of social or professional behavior. That is literally what it means. So in today's world, it's unethical to be nonconformist to popular social views. The likes of Ibram X. Kendi make the arguments of how neutrality, quote unquote, places a pivotal part in prejudice and racism. But I don't think it does. I think in that instance, it allows for people to be objective. It allows for people to see both sides. It allows for people to understand where their fault may be and then change course, make course corrections.
What that guy and a lot of his ilk are doing is they're trying to redefine certain things to their viewpoint.
They're trying to redefine it as moral relativism. It's not moral relativism.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. It truly is. There's a lot of things that are quote unquote relative. But the idea of intentionally swinging whatever pendulum, whatever conversation we're talking about in a different manner, it's more about repairing history in one context or another than it is about anything else.
Which would not be considered fair judgment.
Correct.
Which is not neutrality.
Absolutely correct. But is it neutrality over the course of a broad spectrum of time, or is it neutrality for today? Because that's the argument that's being made.
Yes,
the argument's being made is no, we got to do all this because this happened. And
it's a tit for tat argument.
I agree with you.
Eye for an eye.
I'm totally in agreement with you, but I'm just saying the perspective of that argument is that you have to look over a broader time period than we'd like to today, in that things change all the time. There are things today that we don't even know about that have been changed by people 100 years ago from stuff that was probably really good 500 years ago, but we don't even know about it today because somebody deemed that thing, whatever that thing was, should be shunned and never happen again.
Well, like the genocide of Homo erectus. I mean, where are we fixing that?
The
really?
Zagnotarians.
Yeah.
I
So-
blew that name.
Yeah,
Zagnarax.
Yeah, Zagnarax and the Blefenraffians. So I think that the problem are a few different things. And I mentioned them. I mentioned radicalization. I mentioned moral relativism. And I mentioned ethical fading. I think we should go through them because I think they all are common today. And I think they're all very problematic. We're in spooky season right now. And we're obviously very close to my least favorite time of year, political season. The arguably least favorite, least exciting, least important time of the year, in my opinion. We all know someone who has chosen to make their life about politics. It's their decision. And that brings me to the topic of radicalization, which I think neutrality effectively minimizes. For our listeners and viewers, radicalization is the process by which an individual or group comes to adopt increasingly radical views in opposition to a political, social, or religious status quo, per the Wikipedia. The ideas of society at large shape the outcomes of radicalization. For example, radical movements can originate from a broad social consensus against progressive changes in society or from a broad desire for change in society. Radicalization that occurs across multiple reinforcing pathways greatly increases a group's or individual's resilience and, in turn, lethality. By compromising a group's ability to blend in with non-radical society and to participate in a modern national or international economy, radicalization serves as a kind of sociological trap that gives individuals no other place to go to satisfy their material and spiritual needs. A prime example is the last few years and the you're either with us or against us nonsense. There have been a few individual recognized pathways that lead towards radicalization. The first one being personal grievance. Revenge for a real or perceived harm inflicted upon oneself by an outside party. There's group grievance, which is different from personal in that the subject perceives harm inflicted on a group that they belong to or has sympathy for. Accounts for political and ethnic radical violence in which action is taken on behalf of a group at large rather than as an act of personal revenge. There's also slippery slope, which is a pathway of gradual radicalization through activities that incrementally narrow the individual's social circle, narrow their mindset, in some cases desensitizing them to violence. Also referred to as true believer syndrome, is a product of which one becomes increasingly serious about their political, social, and religious beliefs as a product of, quote-unquote, taking the next step. Love is also a pathway to radicalization, ironically enough. Extremism can be developed from a tight-knit group of people who share religious, economic, social, and sexual bonds. Risk and status, so high-risk behavior offers a pathway to status as it becomes reconstructed as bravery and commitment to the cause. There's unfreezing, which is a term that refers to a loss of social connection that can open an individual to new ideas and a new identity that may include, in brackets, political radicalization. This has actually been shown in prison radicalization, interestingly enough. Individuals who otherwise would not have been a part of certain racial, religious, or gang identity groups are in prison circumstances more affiliated than they otherwise would have been not being in prison. And then there's also isolation, which reinforces the influence of radical thinking by allowing serious and or persuasive members of the group to disproportionately define the body's agenda. I think neutrality can effectively neuter a lot of those things, especially when it comes to being fair-minded and in some ways to the quote-unquote synonym of neutrality objective to whatever the topic may be. I think the danger in a lot of ways when it comes to either political or social or cultural or any vitriolic argument is that we tend to jump on the bandwagon of something because it makes us feel good or because it fulfills a bias of something that we previously held. We don't have to do that. There's not a requirement anywhere in society that says that we should do that. And I think that radicalization also eventually moves into the areas of moral relativism and eventually into the areas of ethical fading, which we'll get to in a second.
Do you think a lot of this has to do with the human aspect of wanting to belong? Because what you're talking about with almost all of these points that you just brought up is a pull in the direction of some kind of power structure. Mm-hmm. One way or another, polarized, whether it's isolating somebody to get them to be more radicalized in a different group's nature, the slippery slope aspect, the grievance aspect. Certainly, there's
Very common.
Very, very common. I mean, there's a million 12-step programs all for people that have gone through something in life, because everybody's gone through something.
Yeah.
And I very understandably, part of the power of the social media today is that it gave voice to people that didn't know they had one.
I disagree with that.
Well, you can disagree,
I don't agree.
But you're welcome to be wrong.
I think they knew that they had a voice. They just never enacted within it.
No, there are tons of people that believe they've gone through something personally that that is unique with themselves, and then they discover that it's not. They discover that there's a group of others, many others, that they can, socialize with, that understand what they've gone through. There's power in that.
Sure.
There's a lot of power in that. So when I look at all these different types of radicalization, these different things that you're talking about, the status, the unfreezing, the polarization, isolation, slippery slope, which I think is the number one. The polarization, slippery slope are the two that kind of jumped out at me the most. They all kind of smack of the idea that there is a human need for people to be associative.
And I think you're correct. The question I would have in response to that is, why is it so much worse now? And the answer, obviously, would be social media. With that being said, it's not as if people who didn't have social media prior to that didn't have some level of influence. They didn't have some communication. I mean, prior to social media was the public square.
I think
and prior to that was the arts. And prior to that was a myriad of different things.
It's like everything else. You could write a letter back when writing letters was normal to connect between somebody on the East Coast and West Coast.
But I think
now you don't have to.
I think the difference...
You can get them on FaceTime anytime you want.
I think the difference is that now we've become so ridiculously polarized that every few years, people who are relatively in the middle, we have our positions, but we're relatively in the middle and we can listen to people without losing our shit, have to be concerned about the reactionary responses from individuals who choose not to operate within that way.
Well, the difference now is those who are on the opposite coin of you are always readily available, loud, and in your face
because
immediately.
Of social media. And
when
I don't
before, it was maybe a little harder to voice your opposition, at least on such a grand scale.
I think it was harder to voice such an illogical opposition because you had to convince people. Now you can just post something and someone will listen to it and be like, well, that aligns with my bias, so it's true.
This goes back a lot to what we've talked about over the course of many episodes about the emotional versus the logical aspect of interrelations. And I said a moment ago, writing a letter. Think about the nature of that.
Very intimate.
Well, it's not only intimate, it's very precise. If you want to communicate your feelings onto a piece of paper that somebody won't get for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is, depending on where the person is, you have to learn how to communicate in a way that most youngsters do not know how to communicate today. They don't. And they don't have to.
Yeah.
Because the world they're growing up in, and you guys came into this world right at the infancy of some of this stuff, before the social media aspect, but right at the infancy of the online stuff in general, in the ability to communicate via an email. I mean, emails were barely out when you guys were born. So the method of communication has changed so dramatically. The lack of human-to-human interface has been exchanged for something that is
self-absorbed.
Certainly. But the method of communication does not have to be precise. It has to be emotional.
Well, I guess that's my point in the radicalization aspect of things is, and some people might not like me saying this, I think people who tend to be ultra radicalized are most of the time concerned with themselves. And I mean that across the board, whether it be in any category, positive, negative, when the thing that they are thinking about is purely only within their sphere, they tend to only be able to relate to individuals if those people bring that particular thing up. Otherwise, they have a hard time, to your point, struggling to relate and fit in. But the funny thing about all that is it's a conscious decision. If you want to fit in with someone, you know how you do it. You ask them questions. You learn about them. Just ask simple questions so you fit in with people. And if someone doesn't receive or isn't receptive to you, then you find someone else. And that's just, tough. As the frat boys say, tough teddies, bro. Like, that is literally life. Like, you can't expect everyone to like you, can't expect everyone to agree with you. And the problem with radicalization is that it blows right by any semblance of ability to communicate. You can't sit down with someone and be neutral if they're being radical, because they won't listen to you. You can say anything as logically as you want to. You can appeal to their bias. You can appeal to their emotions, but they won't listen to you on merit purely because you're not a part of their group. And we talked about this with Professor Joslin. It's 100% true.
I understand what you're saying. I think it has more to do with the speed in which these things happen than it does that they happen. I mean, the phrase "birds of a feather flock together" has been around for as long as I've been around, or longer, much longer, I'm sure. And that says the same thing. It's just those birds were harder to get together.
Yeah.
Now, the birds can flock, and they can become bigger flocks, and they can falsely identify each other as part of the same flock, and they can make a mess of things.
Yeah, but they don't have to. And I think
of course
every single one of them is aware that they don't have to.
But if everyone in the echo chamber tells you you're right, to each other, all of them, you begin to think you're right.
Stop listening to them.
Well, I understand what you're saying.
I'm just a contrarian. That's the problem.
You can be a contrarian.
I'm a contrarian.
You said a second ago, ask questions. Do you know how few people even know how to do that?
This is where I get up in arms about this, because there seems to be, like we've talked about, like we were talking about with the time thing, and I don't know if this is just a social quirk that humans have just engaged in, but there seems to be a I don't want to say excusatory, but a nature in which society has decided to just let consistent things slide on one end. So for people who are radicalized, they can't connect with people. They don't know how to read a book. They can't search on the internet. They can't better themselves. They can't change. They can't become better. Like, they have so many excuses. And then the people who actually would be perceived, if we're going to talk about goodness, I'm not saying anyone here is, I'm just saying the people who would be perceived as good have all these things lent up against them that they have to fulfill in order to perceive that way. It just seems very odd. And I've noticed it as time goes on, because we can talk about anything. We talk about people who are ultra radicalized in a cult, or ultra radicalized in science, or ultra radicalized in one way, and everyone just seems to give them every fucking excuse in the book. We're all adults here. Like, look.
But we're not.
Yes, age-wise we are. And legally we are.
Well,
so that's
maybe legally.
So that's my point.
Not.
But that's my point, is even if they're not, society, civilian interaction, the responsibilities that we've talked about in civic duty would require you to be so 200 years ago. For some reason, it doesn't.
But the ability to see anything, watch anything, have very few parameters on how to conduct yourself in life, those don't exist like they did 50 years ago. They just don't. Trust me.
I think they do. I just think people ignore them.
No, they don't exist.
I think people
there used to be standards.
I think there still are.
No, they're not. Well, there's standards, but they keep being that window we've talked about.
Yeah, they're ignored.
Well, no, they're not ignored. Half of the stuff that you and I think are funny today was about as radical as it could possibly be.
Yeah, George Carlin. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, his stuff has seemed as tame today. I understand. I guess
so. Things change in that manner.
I think,
but what ends up happening is there becomes this idea, a perspective amongst a lot of people that anything fucking goes.
Well, and this comes back to moral relativism, and this segues into our next point. For those of us who are still here, listening to us ramble, moral relativism, I think, is interesting when it comes to neutrality. In most ways, I believe people conflate those two things. I think people see people who are neutral as being morally relativistic, and I don't think that that's true. Moral relativism is the idea that there is no universal or absolute set of moral principles. It's a version of morality that advocates, quote unquote, to each her own or their own, per your point a second ago. And those who follow, it's a who am I to judge? This is from ethicswrapped.edu. Now, there are several different types of moral relativism. There's descriptive moral relativism or cultural relativism that says that moral standards are culturally defined, which is generally true. The ideas of honesty and respect in different cultures can be seen as a good example because those differ. There's some cultures that are more in your face about that. There's some cultures that are a little more reserved. So there's a truth to that. There's meta-ethical moral relativism, which it basically states that there are no objective grounds for preferring the moral values of one culture over another. Societies make their moral choices based on their unique beliefs, customs, and practices, and people tend to believe that the quote-unquote right moral values are the values that exist in their own culture. And then finally, there's normative moral relativism, which is basically the idea that all societies should accept each other's differing moral values, given that there are no universal moral principles, supposedly. The ethical and theological quandaries on moral relativism aside, I don't believe neutrality fits within this mold, even though some might believe that. Ethical actions would be by confronting to approved societal standards, yet most of what is socially approved these days is in direct opposition to the ethical agreements of past years, per your point, making the decisions of society associated with descriptive moral relativism, determining that neutrality, since it is seen as unethical by a lot of groups, separate from moral relativism. So I think that there's a lot of differentiating factors between neutrality and moral relativism, and I think that if you have a healthy understanding of what neutrality really is, I think if you operate within that, which would in turn mean that you're patient and observation, you observe. If you operate within those things, then you can't be a moral relativist because you understand that some things, yes, have universal truths. Some things hold within general logic, and some things should be observed in context before equating whether or not it's your problem. Am I wrong? Am I hitting on too many notes here?
I mean, there's a lot of notes being played.
Yeah, exactly. But a lot of notes means there's some music in there, right?
There is somewhere.
I'm merely a victim podcaster.
The relativism aspect of what you're talking about is interesting because it's hard to sit back and be the judge of any other ethos that's out there without some kind of overriding standard that's understood amongst all the parties. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the problem, right? We're on. We can all agree that we're on this particular planet, right? Mm-hmm. This particular satellite, as you said earlier, riding along on it. Yeah. This pale blue dot, and we can all agree with that. So we can agree that if you jump hard enough and high enough, you're not going to fly off this planet. Mm-hmm. Because there's something called gravity that's keeping us here. Supposedly. Yeah. There's a lot of supposedlies. But the relativistic aspect of this, the moral relative aspect of this, is decided how the history of a particular culture has grown up. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you push history back far enough, it goes from as deviated as it is now to singular a few 100,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So what is the reality? What is the true reality? The reality is you start off as something and you start to branch out as you lose location from each other. That's how it's worked. Mm-hmm. That's because our planet's big, because communication was slow, because people were writing letters instead of getting on social media. It's the same thing I was talking a minute ago. So what's happening now is you're seeing things come back to some form of a more dense, thick trunk of where the world is more singular instead of differential to each other.
Yeah,
and it's interesting to watch because does that take away individualism or not? I don't know.
I think that's entirely different podcast, but I do think that that's a good point because, and we've touched on that before, and I would argue, history would argue that it does. History would argue that we become more collectivist over time because of all these things, and maybe that was with intention. Maybe.
Well, if we roll ahead 1,000 years, if we're around, and if the world communicates the way it does now, there's always going to be pods of people that think differently, right? But supposedly, if we could jump ahead in time, if there is such a thing, and look at it, we would all have kind of a set agreed upon pillars or standards.
Yeah, which would make moral relativism almost obsolete.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is interesting because the people who argue for moral relativism are the same people who would make the arguments of, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Yeah, true. But what happens when Rome doesn't exist and the entire world is one place?
There you go.
And so the same thing with neutrality is I think that the people who argue against neutrality utilize moral relativism as a catalyst, but don't understand that they're conflating two separate things.
Well, you can't be neutral then. If you agree that at some time in the future things come back together and there's become some more universal standards because of the way we view our world.
Yep.
As smaller instead of larger, as less diverse, etc. More diverse to get less diverse is kind of the way it goes. If you believe that, then you have to believe that there isn't a neutral, because somebody's got to determine the standards.
I don't think that
if there's differences right now in the cultures and how they believe their ethics lie and their standards lie.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to win that standard.
Sure, but I don't think that erases neutrality. I think that erases the complication of what would be considered non-normative existence across cultures. Only normative to those people that exist within the cultures, right? So if my normality here in America is different than somewhere else, it's non-normative to those people. But if everywhere is the same, the neutrality actually is easier to work within.
But does something evolve to sameness, or does something have to take critical mass in one direction or another? Because that's my point.
Could be both. I mean, depending on what we're talking about.
If it evolves, then you can stay neutral because it's just going to happen naturally.
Yeah. So
nobody believes that.
But if it if it moves, as per your point, to a critical mass, eventually it would have to evolve from whatever point that would be.
The critical mass is determined by who's pushing a particular standard or agenda.
Well, wasn't that technically a form of evolution, though? Technically, it's not natural.
That's not. Evolution implies a slow march toward the survival of the fittest.
Well, in the grand scheme of things.
But when you throw in cataclysm, that can be, in the long expanse of time, it can be part of it, I suppose.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
But it's more of a dramatic shift, a push because of some circumstances outside of the control of the
question
evolving parties.
To end that, though, the question I would have is, would that be considered a dramatic shift only within our perspective of present day, or would it be considered a dramatic shift in the future?
Well, everything diminishes over time, just like we spoke about a while ago.
Yeah.
Right? The longer time period we look at, the more we can see the pattern.
Because I'm sure the total destruction of the woolly mammoths would be seen as non-evolutionary, but in the broad scheme of things, technically
it is, right? But technically, the Earth was ruled by dinosaurs for a whole lot longer than it has been by us.
And then before that,
and then a big meteor came along and kaboom.
Well, no, right? Actually, 737s full of thetans who dropped people into volcanoes. The volcanoes erupted, causing the Third Age, which was a part of when Sauron came back into power, and Samwise and Frodo had to go to Mount Doom.
The Zaggernauts.
To fight the Zaggernauts, and Batman was there fighting the Hulk, who was also in a desperate battle between the whatever his name is, the one guy who's a part of the same universe, clearly not a part of the same universe, the Harry Potter guy, thus who must not be named.
Voldemort?
Voldemort. The Hulk was fighting Voldemort. So obviously, this is a very historical incident in which during the Battle of 1842, commonly referred to as the French Revolution.
So glad I'm not in his.
I'm just conflating a bunch of different things. Anyway, my whole point is I do think that neutrality gets rid of, in some ways, the pitfalls of moral relativism if you understand the differences. If you don't, and you just like conflating things definitionally, to each his own.
The real problem with all this
is ethical fading.
Well, it's certainly fading. It's certainly fading. Mm-hmm. But again, from a historical perspective, if you're 1,000 years from now, did it really fade, or did it just change into a better form of ethos by the people that are still around 1,000 years from now?
Yeah.
We're human beings. We suck.
Yo, dog. Yo, bro.
Done some things.
Yo, bro. Well, yo, dog, bro.
You're the dog. I'm the bull.
Yo, bro. Yo.
Yo, bro.
We don't use those terms here, okay? We're very positive. This is a PC podcast. Positive
I apologize.
cultivation
I am
podcast.
100% sure humans suck.
That's really positive of you. So to ethical fading, to fulfill your observation, there are plenty of appeals to emotional arguments in today's pop culture. We can see them almost everywhere. Those who do not engage in some of those arguments sort of measure their own analysis in relation to the aforementioned phenomena. They tend to find themselves duped when it turns out that their quote-unquote ethical position wasn't ethical at all. Now, ethical fading occurs when the ethical aspects of a decision disappear from view. This happens when an individual or group focuses heavily on some other aspects of a decision, virtue signaling or winning or social status, per ethicsunwrapped.edu. They tend to see what they are looking for, and if they are not looking for an ethical issue, then they miss it altogether. Psychologist Anne Tenbrunsel found innate psychological tendencies often cause us to engage in self-deception, which blinds us to the ethical components of a decision. This, in turn, helps us overlook our wrongdoing. Ethical fading is like moral disengagement in that it restructures reality to make an individual's actions seem less harmful than they actually are. Both help people minimize the guilt that they feel from violating ethical standards. Neutrality can assist in counteracting these positions since it should be fair and objective. Taking time to observe and determine bias or not can assist us in recognizing when we choose to put ethical concerns behind other factors in making our own decisions. So, why does this all matter? It doesn't.
Spoiler.
Doesn't matter at all. In the broad scheme of things, it doesn't at all.
You know, there's probably another species up there watching this podcast right now.
They're studying very closely.
Got trillions of views on
These are the three most perfect human beings with the most perfect thoughts and opinions. We must gather all the information we can.
Anal probes incoming. We must discover where their energy is coming from.
Well, I was going to say they're up there debating with each other because they've got a prime directive. And they're like, we have got to get down there.
We need to interfere.
They are so bad. They're so terrible. And one of them's going, yeah, we went down there a few 100,000 years ago and tried to bump their genome a little bit. And look what it did to us. You know, well, hell, that's because
we all got sick and died.
Yeah, exactly.
Got poisoned.
Well, and one saying to the other one, well, that's because you did that, Bruce. And nobody likes you anyway.
His name is Bruce and not... Interesting. He's an American name.
That's
very strange.
It's just the American name.
That's his name. I'm not sure why you guys are using...
Nobody but the Zaggernauts could figure out how to pronounce that.
Maybe I'm a part of their group. Maybe it must be known to me. Maybe I'm a plant. Like a tree. I'm just spreading my tendrils.
His American name.
Beep, boop.
Bruce.
Beep, boop,
Beep, boop. Spread tendrils. Beep, boop. Pyramids were not built by humans. Beep, boop, beep, boop. They were planted here by a superior race.
Everybody knows that. I mean, come on.
Lady Liberty is actually a giant robot.
Who would decide to put a pyramid over in Egypt and one in South America at the same time?
Multiple.
They're microphones for each part of the world.
Or
they're like
their nipples.
They're connected.
No comment.
It all comes back.
They're not nipples. They're not in that geometric shape. No.
Okay.
Agree to disagree. Yeah, so none of this matters at all. And at the end of the day,
I think your ethics are fading.
They could be. We're not that advanced. Humans are just not that advanced. We don't have the capacity to be able to be completely neutral. Per the bull's point, he is absolutely correct about that. And we simply cannot handle a world in which we can't identify with things that provide us with emotional stimulus. With that being said, being wary of the arguments from those who choose to make hasty generalizations or appeals to emotions, especially when it comes to social, cultural, religious, and national quandaries, is a valuable thing to engage in. Doesn't mean you can't believe the things, doesn't mean you can't participate, doesn't mean you can't have a goddamn t-shirt that says, I support that thing. It just means you should take the time to actually consider what you're supporting and not just jump on the bandwagon. We're not advocating for non-position frankly. We're not advocating for that at all. We're advocating for quite the opposite. We're advocating for a well-measured position. And through the use of neutral thinking, fair-mindedness, objectivity, and plenty of discussion can be had in an atmosphere that would rather prevent discussion in the first place. So that's why I believe neutrality is an important thing that we should measurably engage in and not adopt as a personality trait.
You have been weighed and you have been measured.
And you're a duck. We're drowning you.
You have been found wanting.
Wrong movie.
Yeah, that was what Bruce said when he came down the first time.
You've been down wanting of justice.
Helicopter.
Yeah, well, we're going to end on those references that none of the Zoomers understand, or millennials, really, for that matter.
Well, ultimately, the problem with all this is it's so hard with the way technology is advanced. Even you guys are old in technology because you can see the cliff difference. And I say cliff because it has been one. You can see the cliff difference between what was and what is. And who knows what will be.
I know.
We don't know.
When we were in high school, I mean, it was bad if you accidentally turned on the internet on your phone because it was about to charge like $20 a minute or something.
Yes, I remember those invoices, by the way.
Yeah.
But consider that.
How
was
many
when
texts
we were
did you have, Bale? How many?
Those were the days when you wrote, hey.
0. I was still operating on rotary phones.
NMU. Yeah.
Yeah, well, hopefully this episode gave you some food for thought. Obviously, this is a complicated topic, and, you say
really that every time.
It is.
They're
we make
simple topics. They're simple.
Well, we make it more complicated than it needs to be, much like anything. But
be good, do right.
Be good to each other, bro. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this episode interesting, if you liked what you saw, if you liked what you heard, if you liked anything about the episode, please go ahead and leave us a comment, leave us a like, give us a subscription on YouTube. We have episodes weekly most of the time. And we would love for you to become a part of the Wolf and Bull family, which also could maybe be Warner Brothers. I've just realized that our name has a W and a B in it. And now Wolf and Bull.
Let's fight them for the logo.
We should.
You could be part of the Zagnots.
The Zagnaraks.
I cannot pronounce it. What? Zagnaraks.
Zagnaraks.
In the blue.
Think of Ragnarok, but like with
Zagnarak.
Zagnarak. But yeah, that's it. That's the end of the episode.
That's all, folks.
That's all, folks.